what the texture of the dance community was like in the 70s and 80s. And I can speak to some of that since I grew up here and I went to Wilson High School and I was dancing, but not with any future intentions in mind. I just loved it. So I was studying ballet, jazz, and a little bit of modern. And it was brought to my attention that Reed College had a 6-week summer dance program. And that was authored and held and fundraised for by Judy Massey, who was, I don't know if she was considered a professor at the time, but she was the head of the dance program at Reed College, and her husband Dick Tron, who taught there, and by Keith Martin. And Keith Martin, I'm going to get it wrong, but someone else will be able to correct me. It wasn't Portland Dance Theater, that was Jan Dreyer and Judy and all those people, but it was, he had his own, another modern dance-based company here that Amy Bennett Gaylor and many other dancers were in. And together, they wanted to create an intensive summer study. So in my senior year in high school, after my senior year, I studied jazz there with Leslie Watanabe, who at the time was this wild man in jazz and was really opened up a whole fissure for me about jazz. And over the subsequent 3 summers, after my freshman year in college and my sophomore year in college, I got full scholarships to study. And I studied with the head of the Graham School. They brought the head of the Graham School Arm Guard, and they brought Karen Addix from the Cunningham Company, and they brought Matt Maddox, who taught some Luigi jazz, and they had ballet. They had a little bit of somatics, which was completely unknown to me at the time. It was early idiokinesis work, which I went on later to study. So it put me into an intensity with a kind of modern dance sensibility at the heart very early on in my studies. And there I didn't know I was meeting other artists who lived and worked here because I was not their peer. They were far more sophisticated than I. But it was a huge piece in me keeping the serious study of dance at the center of my academic training.
Mm-hmm. And pretty early on in your interest with dance.
Yes, that would be 80, 81, 82. So yes. And so then I would go back to school and study during the year, and that all snowballed on each other. And again, none of that was really with the idea that I would do anything with dance. I just was following something that turned out to be bigger than I imagined. But at the time, it was just so much fun. So much fun, yeah.
Do you know, this might be a question for Carla or somebody at Reed, the history of that dance program, more like when it began and when it ended? Well,
I know it began long before I started. My sense is it had a 10 to 15 year run, and that might even Carla may know about it because of her history there, but it may even predate Carla, because that was before Carla was a student there. I'm going to guess that someone like Amy Bennett Gaylor or Josie Mosley, because those two artists were very intimately connected to Judy Massey, because Judy was connected to Dancers Workshop, which was not a company, but much like Conduit later was a consortium of independent artists, ensuring themselves a clean, warm space to teach, perform, and rehearse. So.
And did you do work at Dancers Workshop? I
took some classes. I did, even in the summer when I would come home. It was my first Lamone class I took there. At the time, I didn't know who Amy was, but I took Amy's class. Joan Guinness Burns, who I just saw the other day. I'm not sure I took a class from Josie at the time. Ruby Burns, who was one of the first people, and the only woman, I think, at the time teaching any West African dance. There were Bruce Smith and many other men, but I think Ruby Burns was the only woman at the time teaching West African dance. Fabulous teacher, fabulous person. And so I did, and then later when I returned to Portland to teach at Jefferson in 1986, there was not enough studio space for a Modern 4 class, which is the class that I taught, or Keith and I would switch. So we actually rented the Dancers Workshop space at the time, and all the advanced students would get on the bus. We would drive downtown, have class at the Dancer Workshop space, and then drive back to Jefferson. So
when was that?
That was probably 1987. So it took Keith and I about a year to develop the advanced modern class. And so that was 87, 88. And that is when they were down in Chinatown, right? It was the old PCVA space, Portland Center for the Visual Arts, which predated Art on the Edge, which predated PICA. It's all a big spiral.
was talking with Serinda, and she was saying, I was being like, I want to kind of tell like a narrative arc of dance in Portland, and she's like, I don't see it like an arc. It's really more of a web. And
Yeah,
I was like,
it's a double helix in some ways, you know? Yes, it's very interesting. So by the time I returned to Portland to teach at Jefferson in 1986, the summer dance intensive was gone. So I'm gonna guess maybe 84 was its last year, perhaps? Okay. Yeah, Terry and I, Mathern, and her sister, Sandy, and I were all in the same class. We didn't know each other at the time, but we were all essentially the same age, studying dance in the summer there, later to be colleagues, so.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And let's, you started talking about Jefferson. Let's talk about that more and about how, specifically how that program has influenced and affected the larger contemporary dance community of Portland. Yeah.
So I was hired by Deb Roska to teach at Jefferson High School starting in the fall of 1986. And when I arrived, Keith V. Goodman, was already, he'd been there a year just teaching a single modern class. And Deb was a very brilliant architect of a complete dance program. And the program that was underwhelming at the time was the modern program. They had very developed tap, very developed jazz, very developed ballet. Elena Carter and Joe Wyatt were teaching there. And the modern program was just didn't have its total sea legs yet. So when Keith and I met, we had a meeting of the minds that was excellent and easy. And so Deb really encouraged us to flesh out the pedagogy and the curriculum for a full modern program, which we did. And that took about a year, and I still have all that paperwork and that Keith and I did together, and with Deb, and that lineage included some actually classes that were called Dance 1 and Dance 2, so really trying to broaden, so we weren't in style, we were in principles, and then students could then focus more and take a Modern 3 class and a Modern 4 class. And Keith and I would flip, and so in that arc of the 3 years that Keith and I shared that life together, we brought Danny Lepkoff, so we definitely were tending towards experimental practice because so much of the rest of the program was anchored, in Broadway and in jazz because tap and all those places that lives, and or a more modern dance, sort of pre 1960, for instance. And Keith and I, of course, had cut our training on post-Judson work for the most part. So we brought in Danny Lepkoff, who's an improviser and a contactor early days. We brought Bibi Miller in and her whole company to show sleep studies. We brought Felice Volshong in, who's a contactor and was trained at Juilliard. We brought Cindy Cummings, Mary Oslin, just many different people in. So the students really got to meet artists that were working in modern dance, postmodern dance, whatever the right language is, and at all levels, people who were living in New York, doing the Dance Gypsy life, traveling around the world, and could really speak to them about the nature of that aesthetic point of view. And we created Modern Dance Laboratory at that time because at that time in the history of Jefferson, there was only, no, I shouldn't say only, but there were the Jefferson Dancers, which was the primary performing arm. And if a student either didn't want to be that plural, to be a JD, you really had to have tap, ballet, jazz, really solidly. And for students who didn't have that breadth of interest, there was really no other performing opportunity. And we had some students at the time who really were interested in a more modern perspective, and so we created Modern Dance Laboratory, and we rehearsed twice a week after school, and we created work, and we produced concerts for them, and that laboratory still exists.
Sweet.
Yes.
So something I hear you saying is that you brought in a lot of outside influences into Jefferson, including people who are choreographers based in Portland.
Yes.
And so that affected the Portland community by bringing people in, but did you see a way that what was happening at Jefferson was going out into the Portland community?
Well, some of the students who graduated from Jefferson with this more postmodern contemporary dance interest went off to many universities around the country and got trained, and many of them came back and are artists in our community. Some of them didn't leave and just became immediate practitioners. Almost all the time that we brought guest artists, we invited members of the community to come take those classes, or we staged classes here at the same time. So there was a time when we brought Danny Lepkoff in to work with our students, and I had him come and rehearse the work I was working on with my project at the time. I didn't have a company, but I had a project-based company. And Danny came and did 3 days with us to sharpen our improvisational skills. So it really, I think and I know Keith did the same. So it not only created work for makers here, Mary and other people who came in, but it also brought those tool sets into the community in a more deliberate and active way. Yeah. And some of the people who Keith and I ended up bringing to Jefferson later, we brought back as part of Conduit's Summer Dance Intensive, because we tried to resuscitate what the Reed College summer dance experience had been like, because there was nothing in the summer, except, ongoing classes. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, but nothing that was kind of like seminal in that way. Yes,
where people, studied intensely all day long, 9 to 9, and there's nothing like that experience where you immerse, with a community of people.
And that's what you got at the Reed summer program?
Yes, I mean, I started my day at 9 or 10, and I was finished at 8 o'clock, completely spent, and I'd have danced all day, in 5 or 6 styles. Yes, it was amazing.
So Keith is a name that you've talked about a lot, and I'm interested in, since he can't tell his story, I'm interested in the people that have worked closely with him telling about their experience working with him. Are there memories that you have of working directly with Keith that kind of bring some insight to your process, but as well as his?
Yeah, so makes me a little verklempt. Let's see. So, Keith and I met as 2 professionals, as educators first. And of course, he was far more experienced he had had a whole professional career in Washington, D.C. and New York. He had danced with Liz Lerman's company for a very long time. He had a beautiful early history with ballet, which caught his attention as a young boy, and then went on to study at the Cunningham School. And he moved here and he worked with many other people. And so, but we had an immediate meeting of the minds about our love for contemporary dance practice. And so we worked intimately, as I shared at Jefferson, on a conceptual level, like what does it mean to teach someone about this work? What are the elements? And so we really dissected training and thinking and history and aesthetics very deeply. We were very interested both in aesthetics. How do you communicate aesthetics? And I think we created I think we had a very unique fabric in our relationship, because it started through a real exchange of dialogue about educating people. And then of course Keith had been here for several years before I arrived, so he knew Mary intimately, Mary Oslin very intimately, and had danced with many other people. And as my colleague, he ushered me into all those communities. And so we spent many hours dancing together, some in Mary's work, some in his work. He invited me to be the only other member of a duet. Obviously, he was creating for his commission for the Contemporary Dance Series at Portland State, which was a 45-minute duet. We worked on it for over a year, and just he and I in the studio. Very intimate rite of passage for both of us, to find ourselves, 15 years later or 10 years later from our initial meeting, working in this matrix as peers, although he was the director.
What was the name of that duet?
What was the name of that duet? Hold on, I'm going to remember it. I might have to look it up.
Yeah, and I'm asking more for me so that I can find the footage or like a photo from that or something to...
It's definitely in the PS, because Min was commissioned as well as Greg. It was the men's only event I was telling you about.
Right.
And what was that called? I can't remember, but I can find it.
That's all right, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then of course when Conduit was opened, we worked here. Again, we kind of refound our educational arc, because we were talking about what's the pedagogy of the studio? Like what are we each bringing? And then I got to watch Keith really dive into this whole, I won't say it's a new world for him, it was an undeveloped world when he got very interested in the Afro-Caribbean work and the Haitian work and the Candomblé work and all of that, which became a whole area of research for him and really shifted his work in a very interesting way. Yeah.
Nice.
I spent hundreds of hours with Keith. Hundreds of hours.
Yeah, and I'm sure every one of them was well spent.
It was awesome. Yeah.
Since there's some things chronologically I want to jump back to later, but since you kind of brought up that coming to Conduit was a place where you're able to start to engage in a whole new way and to ask what are we doing pedagogically, what do we want to bring to the space. Can you talk about those beginning days of Conduit and what they were like?
Sure. So Conduit had a lovely and odd beginning. So at the time, in 1992, several things collapsed, I would say, in the went quiet. One of them was the dance department at Portland State, which people had depended on to see the world, basically, because that contemporary dance series brought artists from around the world to Portland. And so we were fairly current with things that were happening. And then Dancers Workshop, after being around for so many years, finally closed its doors, all in that 91, 92 period. And so PSU and Dancers Workshop had been places people could study, where you could see work, where you could meet with other colleagues. And those things just kind of went quiet. And there were very few places to work. So I had opened a studio called Coil in 1993 that was only appropriate for working. You couldn't teach there, you couldn't perform there, had pillars, but we needed something, a place to work. And Mary was many people rehearsed there, and one of them was Mary, and we were very close colleagues. And we decided we wanted to teach a summer dance workshop in 1995. So we rented the ballroom downstairs in this building, in the Pythian building, and we taught a 2-week workshop at which Tawny Holt was home from college and took our workshop, and Tracy Broyles was trying out Portland for the first time. And it was, there were 40 people in this room, and Mary and I team taught for 2 weeks. And when we were wandering around the building one day, I came upstairs to use the bathroom, and the door to Conduit was open. I walked in, and it was for rent. So at the time, Greg was dislocated. Keith had never had a studio. Michael Menger's really big dance company was rehearsing at Coil, and so was Mary. And we saw this room, and Mary and I said, let's do it. So we put together a business plan, and we invited Greg and Keith and Michael Menger to be our cohorts. And the goal of the space was to preserve a place for independent dance artists in their own companies, with their own aesthetics, to be able to function as they wanted to, with their own missions, but knowing that we need a clean, warm, consistent space in order to teach, to make our work, and to perform the work. So when Conduit opened, each of the core artists were guaranteed 40 hours of rehearsal time a month, 2 weekends of performance to be negotiated with everybody else, and 1 teaching slot a week, 1 2-hour teaching slot. And that was it. Everybody paid $200 a month, and that's what you got. So for $2,400 a year, you got a performance space, a teaching space, and a rehearsal space. And at the time, the teaching money didn't flow through Conduit. So Keith would walk out with $400 after one class. Mary and I would split, so really at the time in one class you could make back your entire month's of rent. So Conduit became this incredible site where the classes were cheap, people took 3 or 4 classes a week, and so in terms of your question about aesthetics, like Greg got to really be Greg. I got to really be myself. Mary got to be herself. Keith, and everybody got to thrive within an aesthetic that was their own. And our conversations were around what kind of summer intensive can we create that honor what we've already started here, and that artists we want to study with, that we can bring in. And also, how do we keep this safe and lively? How do we, what things do we agree upon? For instance, one of our things that we discussed and had contention around was, should we offer children's classes? And half of our members felt no, and half felt yes, because Keith was very interested in teaching children as part of his aesthetic, Dance Gather. But so other people felt very strongly there are not enough spaces for just artists to do their thing. This is our adult workspace. So, we did have pedagogical conversations, and we really talked about our visions about what dance, how we create the future generation of dancers, how we keep this space neutral enough that each of us can thrive here.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back in history a little bit to Finding the Forest, and to be able to talk about what that was.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the things that I make, Finding the Forest, yes. So from 1986 to 1991, I danced for many people here, many, 10, 12, and didn't really feel a strong urge, the need to make anything. And then I had a very transformative experience in the Columbia River Gorge, and decided I needed to make a project. So in 1991, I initiated my first project here in Portland, professional work, and got a grant from, at the time, the Metropolitan Arts Commission. And it wasn't even a dance grant. It was an interdisciplinary grant. It was a brand new category. And at the time, Christy Edmonds, who I did not know at the time, and myself and Helen Lessick, who was a very unusual artist here, all got these interdisciplinary project grants. And because the nature of the work was interdisciplinary. And I sort of surprised myself when the thought of this project came up, because while I danced very virtuosically for other people, the project that I needed to make was something that was site-specific. It was, allowed the audience a very high degree of autonomy. It had no clear beginning and end. It was free and open to the public. It invited both trained and untrained people to be part of the texture of the performance event. And it invited artists from many different disciplines, so it was completely interdisciplinary. And I'd never made anything like that in my life, nor was I educated to make a thing like that. It was a completely visceral and intuitive response to an event I'd had in the forest, in the gorge. And that project turned out to be reflective of the entire of things that I've made over the last 25 years here. While I've made a few things that live in prosceniums and studios, the bulk of the gestures of my creative history here have been site-specific, most of them outside, interdisciplinary, allowing the audience huge autonomy. Most of them, or if all of them, have been free. There is, because city spaces don't have boundaries where you can charge. And they've lived in this hybrid space between dance and visual art. So they're sort of performative installations. And I'm as surprised as anybody else by that interesting counterpoint in my life as a performer and in my life as a very different life as a maker. And those works are all very much highly driven by improvisation, architecture, interest in natural systems, urban studies, things like that.
Cool. Let's talk about some more of those works that you've done. Starting with, in '98, a solo concert. Mm-hmm. And that was not site-specific. That was
yes.
Performance space.
Yes. So in 1998, I had made quite a bit of site-specific work, and I was really hankering, is the word that comes to mind, to just work on my skills as a performer. I really wanted that. You know, I didn't ever want to be a New York dancer, but I wanted what I think they had, which was they were there to be so intense to really become the best they could possibly be as dancers. And I had no intention of moving there. I liked my life here. But I thought, how can I create that matrix for myself here? And so I decided to commission 7 people, stylistically extremely broad, to address all my interests and push my buttons, to create solos for me. So I created that was initiated in 1997. The performance was called Not Fully Myself. It was performed at Lincoln Performance Hall. It was a nonstop solo event, so I performed those 7 solos back to back with about a 1-minute crossover between the solos that each choreographer whose work followed the next got to choreograph the kind of sorbet between. So I was never off stage for 70 minutes. And Greg Bielemeyer, Mary Oslin, Stephanie Skira, Drew Prasara, James Canfield, Christy Edmonds, and Josie Mosley created solos for me. And for 1 year, I rehearsed every day from 9 to 2. And then I drove to Vancouver and taught students in Vancouver. And I had this very, very rigorous year. I took Monday off to swim, to work on my cardiovascular strength so that I could actually dance for 70 minutes by myself. And it was a really important moment in my evolution as the performing part of myself. You know, I feel like I've had this arc as an artist, as a teacher, as a performer, and as a maker. And that allowed me to be with myself and really challenge my habits and grow hugely.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Yeah.
As you're talking, I'm remembering seeing that performance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I knew you at that time.
Yeah.
you knew me.
Which is great. And I
yeah.
kind of, hearing you talk about it, it brings back those memories. Then what followed up, not fooling myself, was the urban growth.
The urban growth boundary project. Yeah.
So drastically different. Let's talk about that and why you chose to, like, what led you into that line of research and curiosity.
Yes. So the solo concert, even though I took this time out for a year to just work on myself as a performer, to evolve myself, the interest in kind of how we live where we live, how we engage in our public space, never went away. I just needed to turn that dial down for a while. So in 1999, I was invited by Orlo, which was an organization started by for visual artists to address the environmental issues through aesthetic means, to consider the urban growth boundary. And no, in the history of our state, since 1976, since the UGB has been formed, no artist had ever addressed the urban growth boundary. So they invited 4 of us, wildly different in our practices, to consider the boundary. And I took it as a huge challenge. It was very enriching for me because I grew up here. I mean, that boundary happened when I was a kid, and I paid no attention because I didn't know what it meant at the time. But so I kind of did a giant amount of research in order to deal with that project. I started asking everyone I knew, what's the urban growth boundary? Where is it? Why is it important? And I accumulated this huge amount of feedback that helped me shape the form that project took. And so over a summer in 1999, I lived in a mutable dwelling designed by the Riga architect boys, men to boys, in a mutable dwelling at seven different places on the urban growth boundary line. And the intention of that was to highlight just where the boundary is, what its seam is between, like, you're on a cornfield here and then you're on a house there, and there's like 6 inches of difference. And so people would drive out, my art friends and my city planner friends and my architects friends would have to drive through what they would consider the suburbs to find me, and the people who lived in those homes and in those communities or farmed that land found me, and my living room became the context for a conversation. So in my own practice as an artist, my work transcended. I was not performing. I created a space that allowed performance, meaning conversation, to happen. So it's interesting, all this social practice conversation that's happening, which is, goes back to Capro and all these people. But, the arc of what I've been doing has really been solidly in social practice. I had no idea what it was called that, and that name did not exist at the time. But that project is a really kind of clear example of that kind of work, which again, I didn't really know anything about. I just intuitively felt like I had intended to perform, to do people were going to come visit me and I was going to do some domestic something. And I realized, how ridiculous is that? That's not why they're here. And so it was one of those reckoning moments you have as an artist. But as you know, with dance, if you're working in the moment, I had to make that moment, you don't rehearse that. That just happens. And one has to make a second conceptual decision. And I realized the integrity of the work was I needed to step out of the way and witness this conversation in this very charged space that I had made.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. And let's see here. I'm consulting my list of things to look at. And so let's talk about Trio A and your involvement with Trio A and how you left Portland to study this, but then how studying this, what you're able to come back to Portland with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Trio A is a big piece of my life in many, many, many ways. It's my teacher in many ways, and it's a part of the way I make a living, and it's part of the way that I've connected into this giant web of artists from all over the world. So it's a beautiful link. So in 1999, I happened to be in New York and saw a film of Trio A as part of a visual art exhibit. And I had no idea what it was. I mean, I knew it was a dance, and I knew that was Steve Paxton because he just stayed in my loft a few months before. But I had no tools in my dance education. That aesthetic was not addressed ever, which was sort of embarrassing. And I realized, like, if I'm gonna keep teaching people, I need to and stay in the field, I need to understand what that is and to develop a relationship to it. So I got a fellowship from the state in 1999, and I decided to use that entire fellowship to go back to New York and learn Trio A because there was a workshop. So I did that, and that was my first little dip in the water, and I learned that. And then about a year later, I met another artist, Sitka Center, who was in Trisha Brown's company for years and years. And I had brought her to Oregon Ballet Theater when I was education director to teach Trisha's work and the Alexander technique. And she stayed at my house, and we ended up talking about postmodernism and how much she loved Trio A. And I said, oh, I know Trio A. And she said, oh, let's go learn it together. And I said, oh, I could relearn it. So we then went to New York and relearned it. And in that process, Shelley and I became very close colleagues, and we decided we wanted to have the rights to perform Trio A, so we approached Yvonne to do that. And in the interim, Pat Wong at Reed College was so excited that I knew Trio A and asked me if I would come teach it to her students and mount a whole concert, because Reed has a beautiful history of dance, of remounting works. They have a Doris Humphrey work, they've done a lot of that over the years. So they were continuing a trajectory of their own. So in 2003, Shelley and I mounted a concert where we brought Yvonne. She cleaned Trio A as the only living document of her doing that in the New York Public Library. Yvonne gave a lecture, so people got to come and hear her speak. And Shelley and I performed Trio A, and the Reed students learned it. And at that time, Yvonne invited Shelley and I to not only have the rights to perform the work, but to teach the work in perpetuity. So since 2003, I have taught the work to, I don't know, over 30 people, from solo performers like Linda Austin and Susan Davis in academia, to the Access Dance Company in Oakland, California. And there are now 5 repetiteurs. And this work has been interesting because it's allowed me to really scope away from Portland and to look at Portland in the context of the larger dance world, and also where, each of our roles in dance history, like each of us are part of, our teachers and who they were taught by. And so it brings up lineage in a very personal, but in a very much larger way. And Yvonne is a very generous person and has tapped me into many other artists and many other opportunities. And it also, as you know, as anyone knows who's in the field, you have to have multiple income streams in order to actually do this for a living. And Trio A has become that. From last year, I taught it to Lucy M. and Jen Hackworth. So it lives in my life in many ways. And, at some point, I will pass my custodianship to another person. So it also creates a link in a chain for me to a larger context of artists and historians. Yeah.
Very cool. And then let's go back to looking at your performances, the site-specific, more recent, like the South Waterfront Project.
Yes. So I had the opportunity to go away. I should say I'll start over. So but around 2005, a lot of energy picked up around my site-specific making, and 2 projects got set in place simultaneously. The South Waterfront Artist and Residency program and the City Dance of Lawrence and Anna Halpern project. And both of those the seeds of those were planted in 2005 through a series of relationships that we form over time. The City Dance project, in my long-term relationship with Randy Gregg, as someone who's written about my work and as someone who's very interested in music and architecture, and the history of our public spaces, for sure. And then in the South Waterfront project, my personal experience with growing up, seeing those lots empty and knowing that they were then going to become Portland's first vertical neighborhoods. And, again, asking this question, what does it mean when you take the work of artists out into the community where people can bump into it and in unexpected ways without their preconceived notions having been set up? And those questions have really interested me. And I would say those 2 projects, the City Dance project and South Waterfront, were the most sort of what's the right word? They were quite large manifestations of those interests. And because they were very public, they were very well funded, they involved many, many, many artists that were commissioned inside those projects to make work. And they got, their audience was extremely large, like many thousands of people for both those projects. And the stakes were very high for both those projects because the history of the public spaces and their funding, the Halpern spaces, was very contingent upon the sort of success of those. And in South Waterfront, the sort of integrity of what it means to put artists at the heart of a neighborhood was also an interesting question. So those projects allowed me to sort of complete some thinking that I had started really in 1991 with the Forest Project. And if I look at the sort of most deeply held values in those two very large projects, they're really evident in 1991, 15 or 17 years earlier. And both those projects had their sort of manifestation in 2008. So, and since that time, I have to say, I am not as interested in, I feel like the questions I had about how artists interface in community, how they interface in public space, the sort of aleatory nature, sort of allowing audiences full autonomy to choose how they relate, all those kinds of things. I feel like I answered those questions for me. Not that I don't think there's interesting texture there, but for me, I've answered those questions, and my interests are eclipsing someplace else. I'm not quite sure where they're landing, but yeah.
For somebody who didn't see the Halpern project, how would you describe what that was?
Lawrence Halpern was a landscape architect, and he designed a series of outdoor parks, urban parks, in Portland in the late 60s and early 1970s. And those parks have become the turning point is in his oeuvre. And it was the desire of those of us working on City Dance to draw attention to those parks by using the making fabric of his wife, Anna Halpern, the choreographer, and the artists she was around, like Lamont Young and Terry Riley, these incredible minimalist composers, using music and dance in a way, honoring her aesthetic, to highlight these parks and to create this travelogue that took people over a 2-hour sequence through the timeline of the history of these parks, so they could see the evolution of someone's oeuvre, which was his, in terms of how the language of each of these parks is so different, right? Their materials, the way they're designed, and to give people a sense of what Halpern really wanted, both Halperns, but Larry for sure, what he wanted, the way he wanted his parks to be used, which he wanted people to participate in them, not sit on a bench and watch, but he made them to be used, to be swum in, or stood on, or skateboarded on, or picnicked on, all those things. And so it became, I think it was highly festive. It was very lively musically. I think it was very provocative to be among a community of 1,000 people watching a performance and feeling the intimacy of that, and then traveling up through these alleyways to finding the next destination, opening into this sequence where there was these really abstract performances happening, and then moving to the next. So I think it was kind of reminded me probably of the old days of circuses, right? Where you kind of traveled in with the circus when they came into town, and you went to all those sites and exited. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Are there important things in your arc as a educator, performer, dance maker that we haven't covered? Are there some important holds that help tell your story? I think we covered a lot of ground, and you were incredibly articulate and being very well phrased. I appreciate that a lot. But am I missing anything that feels really pertinent to who you are as an artist?
That's an interesting question.
I also have to keep reminding myself that I'm not trying to get the complete encyclopedia
Of course.
detail.
Of course you're not. Yeah. I'm trying to think.
But just the survey of what bubbles up to the surface.
Yeah. I think that's, I think that's...
The poster of Artquake just popped into my mind.
Oh,
Let's
Artquake.
talk about Artquake.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are you going to talk to Bonnie?
I need to call her.
Okay,
It's
because
very much my
definitely
intent
ask
to do.
Bonnie about Artquake too, because I know she made work for Artquake. Artquake was a festival that had been going on in Portland, a summer festival over the Labor Day weekend, right before we go back. That had been going on for maybe 10 or 12 years by the time I moved back to Portland and was teaching at Jefferson. This is all pre-Conduit. And Artquake was a 3-day opportunity where people experienced the craft arts and food. I mean, people used to call it food quake and craft quake, all those kinds of things, because it was meant to really be for the general public, right? So it needed to satisfy many aesthetic needs. And the year before the project that I did, Ursula Le Guin and Judy Patton collaborated on something in the intermediate theater. So it definitely had sort of concert or high art, kind of things, but also it ran the whole gamut. But every year there was an outdoor commission that people didn't have to buy a ticket for, they could come and witness. And it was always collaborative, and it needed always to be interdisciplinary. And so they put out an RFP, a call for artists, and again, I was a very young maker. I hadn't made Finding the Forest yet, so I hadn't really made anything in Portland yet, actually. I'd been dancing quite a bit, and so 5 years I've been dancing here. And a visual artist named Linda Wysong, who makes quite a bit of site-specific work, was intrigued by our conversations about those things, and she invited me to apply with her. So I did, and we got this $10,000 commission. And I ended up calling on my great improvisational colleagues, Lila Hurwitz, who used to live here, Carolyn Stewart, who still lives here, who was just tapping into her contact, roots, and Terry Carter, who was here for a long time and who's a contactor in the larger world community. And we created this, and so it was also, like the Forest Project, a kind of first expression of these values about there were 9 cycles that happened over the 3 days, and each cycle had 3 sections. It had the building of the structure by the visual artist, and then it had our performance response that was improvised to the structure with a score, and then we took down the barriers and the audience got to go through and have their own time. So I was touching the edges of this way, I don't want to control the audience, the viewer's experience. I want them to shape their own experience. So this notion of the audience as participant and all these things, I mean, these weren't conceptual things I could have said out loud. I could not have said these things at the time, actually. It's only because the art world has caught up,
right.
And this is what people are being taught to do now. And I don't mean to denigrate it, but it was so not my experience. And so I was with these 3 fluid improvisers. So we could construct a work in this way, and they could be patiently abiding by my not really knowing what I was doing. And there was one more year of Artquake after that. So Artquake ended in 92. A lot of things there was a cycle that closed in 92, and then there was this whole, then PICA, and Conduit, and this whole other, it was a generational change, I think. There was a generational change that happened in 1992, 93, 94, 95, which is a generational change is happening now, right now in front of our very eyes as Conduit closes. There's a generational change. And I thought about that today. It's very interesting to be on the other side of that. I mean, I'm on the other side of it, but I am on the other side of it. Different perspective, whatever it is. Yeah, I'm not the engine anymore. I get to ride in the nice luxury car thing.
Right. I know what you're saying. That
It's your job.
Right. You are a very active participant and art maker and dancer, but it's you've helped to make this space happen, and that was a massive contribution. And now it's kind of somebody else's job to take that ball and to do something with it.
Well, yeah, because people have a different level of energy. I mean, they want space to, the PE people, they want their space to this is what we do, and it's awesome. Do you know what I mean? Or you, or whoever's doing their thing. If things don't cycle, there's no space for new energy, and I think it's so important. This space as it exists, closed as this monolith. I think it's awesome. I think it should stay in some form, but I think sad to the room. But yeah. Anyway.
Well said. Let's take a moment to look at some of the people that you've danced with and performed with and collaborated with.
Yeah.
Mary is somebody who comes to mind.
Many years, yeah.
Can you talk about some of your experiences dancing in Mary's work?
Yes. I had the great opportunity to dance with Mary Osland in many iterations as a very young person who moved here in 1987, very unformed, but she saw something that was worth having on stage. And many of her significant works over time, Salvation Pieces, Behavior, which was her National Dance Project commission and PICA commission, Unfamiliar Terrain, Dark Rooms, Ooh Ah were the early ones. And then when I did my solo concert, I had the chance to just be one-on-one with Mary in the studio, 1997 and 98. And that was a very distilled conversation between she and I. We'd been in each other's lives then for 10 years in all kinds of ways. We shared the administration of the space. We were friends and colleagues. We taught together. She danced in the Forest Project with me. I mean, we'd been in many iterations together. And then that was a very distilled experience for us to be in that work. And to be in the studio with Mary is to invite intensity, I think. It's to invite intensity, even if that's intensely soft. It's like really, she gets to that place too that's intensely soft and porous, but it's still very charged. Yeah, and very, yes. And she's very disciplined with herself, I feel, when she's in rehearsal, and so she's very disciplined with the people that are in there with her. Meaning she wants to work when she's in the room. And that was a great model for me to experience. And I've been in the studio with many people. I got the chance to dance with Karen Nelson very intensely over a 2-year period, and that was as incisive. That was as intense and as demanding in a very different style. But and she was far my senior, so huge evolution there. And then with Keith very intensively, Josie Mosley, James Canfield, Bonnie Merrill, many times.
Wait, tell me about the work you did with Bonnie Merrill. That's somebody that I think is so important to Portland dance, but that I haven't gotten a lot of information about. So what's your process was working with her? What kind of work did you do together?
Yeah, well, I was just in things with Bonnie. You want Bonnie to ask you to do things because she's such a pleasure to be in the studio with. Bonnie she's just magical. That's what Bonnie is. She makes magical things, and she is a magical person, and her rehearsals are magical. You just are in there, and she'll look at, there are frogs in my necklace, or she'll open a book and go, what do you think of that? Or she'll bring out a piece of fabric from her China trip and say, oh, I wonder if we can make a pattern with that. And then she's very intense though, very because she gets so excited about her being interested in something. And so you get very detailed. She made a duet for Christy Edmonds. She did a whole duet concert once. Mary Osland and Catherine Peterson was a duet, and Christy Edmonds and I were a duet, and who was the third duet? Joan Finley and Sue Brantley, maybe, somebody. And it was at Dreamswell, Susan Banyas' space, which is another very important space in the city. And it was like being on a playground, but with a really, really intense kid who's driving you along. Nice kid, but really driving you along. And Portland Dance would not be the same without Bonnie. Bonnie was from Portland Dance Theater, right? It was part of that fabric of Jan and Judy and Joan and Phil and Greg and Robert and other people I didn't know that were gone before I was there. And then had her own very particular aesthetic that was sort of tender and fragile and playful and also very quick and sharp, and because she was a ballet kid, so she loved Petit Allegro. Yeah. And when you talk to her, my gestures are totally different than if I'm talking about Keith, because it's just Bonnie. It's just how she is. Yeah.
Were the company we keep in Portland Dance Theater, were those companies that you got to be an audience member and see or work with in some way? Yeah. So Portland Dance Theater and company we keep both had these very different arcs, right? Very different timelines, but were things I witnessed. I got to work with all the artists in company we keep eventually, and in Portland Dance Theater. But Dance Theater I actually saw when I was in the 5th grade. They came to my school to do a young audiences performance, and it was the first time I'd seen someone do something with their body that was imagistic, that wasn't ballet. I was so blown away by it. And
but they had gone through many iterations. They'd become, well, that had ended, and then there was Cirque and all of that. And so I experienced them when I came back here as a young maker. Saw Jan's work, Judy's work, Bonnie's work, Greg's work, all very separately. And Company McKee was happening when I would come back my summers from Stanford, and that was Sue Brantley and Terry Mathern and Dale Schwartz and Phil, all these musician dancer people with Judy Patton. And it was the company of Portland State. It was it was like Second Avenue Dancers from Tisch, it was their thing. And they also came to a demise. So, but I saw 3 performances of theirs.
Wow.
Yes, very abstract, very linear, very, very much not the way I was trained. So it was really interesting for me. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, but they didn't have anything to do with each other except Judy.
Right.
Yeah, Judy was the slide over.
Yeah. And then, did they exist at the same time in Portland, or?
I don't think so.
Right.
Portland Dance Theater, definitely not.
Right.
Cirque may have been, Jan and her space may have been happening and doing things. I'm not sure in that time. That would be a Judy Patton for sure. Yeah, I couldn't slide those timelines for you very well.
That's all right.
Yeah, that would be
Not your work.
Yeah, and Terry can tell you when they started and ended. Portland Company we keep. I don't think but Judy would be the definitive person on that one.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Are there other choreographers that you've worked with that felt particularly influential to your experience here in Portland?
Well, I would say yes. So choreographer-wise, one thing we haven't talked about was that I did. I thought take a very bold step and commission B.B. Miller to make something for me. And she was too expensive, so she ended up setting her solo on me, Rain. And that was another one of those places where I really tried to decide what was going to really challenge me to get better in terms of performing, and commissioning someone that was a superstar was my solution, just like Greg was trying to get Stephen Petronio to make him a solo at one point. And so I did spend a week by myself in the studio with BB, and then subsequent other weeks pushing myself. So I would say witnessing BB's process was very interesting to me and very influential and necessary in the weight in my body. But the other local person who we haven't talked about yet, I was lucky enough to actually work with Jen Dreyer in the very last arc. And I worked with her at a time, she was commissioned to make the really last thing on the contemporary dance series before the university shut it down in 1992. So in 1991, I spent a year in the studio with Joan Findley, who was in Portland Dance Theater, and Greg Bielemeyer in Portland Dance Theater, and Judy Patton, who was in Portland Dance Theater, and Robert Rikers, who was her husband and visual artist and dancer, and Jan. So it was me and like the old guard. And it was so important for me to have that link in that sensibility, because you really don't understand Greg nearly as well unless I mean his sensibility is his own, but you can feel the generation of it from those people, and it really made me. There's no, besides Greg, there's not really an inheritor of that sensibility here. It's an interesting thing that kind of that didn't. Yeah, there's a lot of evolutions of Mary. Do you know what I mean? And that her very unique confluence of textures, but there's not a lot of evolutions of Portland Dance Theater, I think, and I think that's interesting. But all of them, but Jan, because I witnessed her making practice, was very important for me as a bridge.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
We haven't talked about all my fabulous students that are now artists. I'm kidding. Right? You, Sonia, Jennifer Allen, Erin Boberg, Heidi Carlson, all these amazing people.
Yeah.
It's so cool. I'm just kidding you.
But
Rachel,
It is kind of phenomenal how, and this is something that I'm interested in, about how the educational institutions of Portland have supported what's happening in Portland. And
Yeah.
I see that, like you directly, you've taught so many people here that are making dance here now, or dancing. And it makes me wish that, since there is such an obvious direct connection, that there was more, like that there was a major at PSU, or there were just more resources because I'm seeing with what's here that so much is happening, and if there was more training, then I don't know.
Well, Terry's a result of that. They had a program. Min is a result. I mean, we have Min because Min came because of his experience, but then he was here, he trained. It was his gift. He's a beautiful, beautiful mover. And there was a place for him to train. And look what's happened in our city. Terry, a beautiful example of that. You know, Sue Brantley stopped, but, you know, Carolyn Altman was a choreographer here for a long time, and that came out of PSU. And so, you know, you educate people to do something, and the ones for whom it is important to them will go on and become full artists and professionals. You're a beautiful example of that, you know, and there are many other people who are doing that. I mean, Erin Bolberg, she's not making art right now, but, you know, Lewis and Clark. So we need those degrees and those programs, and the high school ones are lovely. VSAA is great, and Jefferson is great, but it would be so wonderful if there were resources in our community to create the next link for those students. Or for students who have been phenomenally trained high school students someplace else to see PSU or Reed or Lewis and Clark as the next destination for their work.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah.